Welcome to Spotlight on the Real Science of Sport podcast with Professor Ross Tucker and Gareth Davies.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Spotlight. We took a break last week because we wanted to let certain Malcolm Gladwell comments percolate, land with our Discourse members, and then we felt the need obviously to follow it up. So hopefully you've enjoyed those 2 episodes with Gladwell. And then we had, of course, a podcast earlier this week, which I hope you listened to, or will listen to, with Drew Gin. Even if you're not into rowing, think of it more as insights into the mind of one of the truly great elite athletes through the lens of rowing. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, on Wednesday, you'd have heard Sean Ingle previewing the Tokyo World Championships, which begin tomorrow. So it's been a busy week, and for that reason, we decided we wanted to do a relatively short spotlight, but important to do one because there's a lot going on and there's a lot happening over on Discourse that we wanted to comment on. We're not even going to get to half of it today, but we felt it was necessary to show our faces, myself and Gareth. So on the show today, we're going to look at the Rugby World Cup, which is now entering its quarterfinal stages. Gareth made a few observations about it this week that we thought we'd share and discuss. Then we're going to reflect on Malcolm Gladwell's comments other than what we've already discussed, because I think it's important. Our Discourse members, to their credit, have picked up what I think was the really interesting stuff. And then finally, we have a few Tokyo thoughts because they start tomorrow, and we wanted to make a couple of picks. Gareth, how are you going? You've obviously your mid-year break has ended, back into the swing of things.
Yeah. Enjoying being back into a bit of a stability. And missing being on the bike so much, I got to admit, but the legs aren't missing it, I got to admit. Yeah.
Very good. Right, so as I said, we have a couple of things we want to get through today. We're not going to cover all the news. There's a lot going on. And those of you, by the way, who do want to share some insights and thoughts on court cases, doping scandals, other sports events going on around the world, as well as your own training, articles you've read, anything that grabs your attention in the world of sport and sports science, Discourse is the place to do that. It's also where we get ideas for the show, so you can contribute to the content. And you become a Discourse member by making a monthly pledge over on patreon.com. Look for the Real Science of Sport, or just click on the link in the show notes. How easy could that be? We begin today, though, I think, with our single Discourse Digest segment, which comes from rugby.
Yeah, the Women's Rugby World Cup. And we're going to have a little review of what's been happening so far, because we've missed a couple of weeks, and have a look forward to the quarterfinals. It's a fairly simple review to do because there have been no shocks, I would say, in the tournament. And I've got to admit, I was starting to get a little bit sort of jaded with the one-sided scores, as we mentioned before. And then one match came along, which was the South Africa-Italy match. And I thought that was the match of the tournament for me so far. Did you see that one?
Yeah, that was a big game in South Africa as well, because, as we've discussed, we've not really invested in women's rugby until now, but we have made that commitment, and so it was a really important game for us to win. Arguably the most important game in the history of South African rugby for women.
Do you think it'll make that one game will make changes in South Africa, change the perception a little bit?
Yeah, the perception, I think they'll be encouraged by the improvement, and they will continue to invest. So I'm sure that by 2029 we'll be even better than we are now. And also, like I say, we've spoken so much about shop windows, put people in the window and let other people emulate them or aspire to emulate them. And for young girls and women to be able to say, I can represent South Africa now, is really important. And that's the case for all the countries.
I mean, from my point of view, Wales have been very disappointing. 3 losses on the bounce. And it got me thinking, because we were talking about professionalism in the women's game before. And Wales has been professional now, I think, for 3 years, and it's clearly not making a huge amount of difference. And I'm just wondering, with the woes of the men's team as well, I think there's something far deeper going wrong in Welsh rugby, and I think it shows that you need to get things right at the top before you can expect any sort of results on the pitch. And I think that's being shown, that just making teams professional and just throwing money at them, it doesn't necessarily just bring success.
Yeah.
You have to really build this from the ground up.
Where do the Welsh women primarily play? In England?
Yeah, I think most of them are in the Premiership, which doesn't make sense, because I was wondering if it was a fitness thing.
Because they've got access to arguably the best competition in the world. They've got proximity. They've got the professional system now, admittedly in its first generation. So you would think they'd be better, but their decline has really mirrored South Africa's improvement. And actually, I was looking at the previous World Cup down in New Zealand's results. The quarterfinals, 6 of the teams are the same. The differences are Wales and Italy. So Wales out, Italy out. South Africa took Italy's place, and I think Scotland go in instead of Wales this time. So, yeah, that is a regression.
Yeah, I mean, World Cup's it has been enjoyable. And as I say, I was thinking about it last Saturday because I woke up and instead of going out on the bike straight away, I wanted to watch the men's rugby championship because it was South Africa, New Zealand, because we didn't know what the outcome was going to be, because it was going to be obviously a clash of two of the best teams in the world. And so that kept me in wanting to watch it because I think you've used the word jeopardy many times in the past, right? And so there's jeopardy about that game and there's excitement. And I was thinking, well, it's nothing. That's what keeps us watching. It's nothing to do with whether or not the women's game has got better quality, worse quality. It's having that jeopardy. And none of the games last weekend, again in the women's matches, really excited me like that because you mentioned the England game to me, and I had to admit to you that I didn't even watch it because I knew what the outcome was going to be, and in effect, I wasn't going to waste my time. And so I looked at the quarterfinals coming up this weekend, and it's another weekend of the same, unfortunately, because we've got New Zealand, South Africa, which is a walkover, Canada, Australia, likely to be very much a walkover, Ireland, France, another walkover, and England, Scotland. So, I mean, England don't even have to bother getting out of bed doing that one, I don't think. And I looked at the odds, and I've never seen odds like it for the quarterfinals of a world tournament in any sport, because I mean, South African women are 100 to 1 against, Australian women are 50 to 1 against, Irish women are 50 to 1 against, and Scotland women are 100 to 1 against. It's just, I've never seen anything like it.
So
And
you're telling me
is
there's
there
a
any
chance?
point in watching?
Are you telling me there's a chance?
No, none whatsoever. And so until we get, there's literally, and looking at the way the quarters and the semis going to go, there's going to be one match, I think, of decent competition before the final, and that'll probably be, well, it will be New Zealand, Canada, and that's it. And then you get to the final, whoever's playing England, and England will probably win it. Well, I think England will win it. Put your house on it.
You don't think England-France will be a competitive game?
Nowhere near. By then, England will be back. I mean, everybody's saying that England had a wobble against Australia.
If they put 40 on them.
47-7, and they weren't happy with the performance.
I know.
I think that's the media trying to make something out of nothing now.
That's exactly what it is, because when I messaged you at the weekend, it was 12-5, 12-7 to England, 20 minutes or so in, and then they just blew them off the field. And it was interesting because I saw afterwards the headlines and the subtext was England given a scare by Australia because they hadn't gotten 2 scores ahead within 15 minutes. So that is the expectation. So anyway, we did say last time we did a spotlight that I think it's the biggest threat to the continued growth of the women's game. The women's growth is clear. The women's game is clearly growing, but there will come a point, maybe 2029, where you can't have. And to be clear, there's been World Cup men's tournaments where the top 3 are so superior to everyone else, but they don't feel like blowouts. And I think the women's game really needs teams 3 to 8 to step up 2 levels in order to get closer to the best 2.
Yeah, you only have to look at the bookies' odds because, as my mother always told me, you never see a skint bookie, and they're not going to have made a mistake on this one. None of these upsets are going to happen. So there were a couple of other things actually that came up.
Yeah.
One of the England players, Ellie Kildun, was concussed, and so she's going to miss the quarters. Not that it's going to make much difference. So, and we saw the flashing mouthguard.
Yeah.
In operation there.
Yeah. Although to be clear, that concussion. You didn't need a mouth guard, you didn't need a light, you need nothing to know that had happened. It was a bad one. And it was interesting because last time we spoke, I shared studies that I'd done and been looked at where women are more likely than men to suffer concussions hitting their head against the ground, but still not frequent. I think it was 1 in 6% of women's concussions, 1% of men's. This was one of the 6% because she took a big bang to the back of the head as she was spun around in a tackle. And the ball hadn't even been cleared from the ruck and the medic was with her. You could see it straight away. It was a problem.
Mm-hmm. But that's not, we talked about it last time, but that would have happened to a man as well, the way that tackle went in when I saw the highlights, because you texted me and I had a look. So it wouldn't have made any difference. And the other thing that came up last weekend was a South African centre I think Shamiza Kawe.
Yeah.
She had a red card after the bunker review. So, and I didn't realize actually they were playing the 20-minute red cards in this tournament. Um, so I think that actually worked quite well because it sort of, although the game was already gone, sort of thing, it does even it up slightly more. And there was nothing malicious in the tackle. That's just literally poor technique. So
Yeah, and she came off actually worse than the French
that.
player. They both went down holding their heads in that specific instance. Yeah, for obvious medical reasons, we can't talk about outcomes and diagnoses and so forth there. But yeah, that was a bad head-to-head clash, which still remains the most likely thing to cause a concussion in terms of tackle events. We found in the men's game anyway, it was 1 in 90 events like that would cause a concussion. And it makes sense, there's two players' heads at risk, but the tackler carries more of that risk, and so I think we saw that there. Yeah, but as for the 20-minute red card, I don't think anyone can object. You know, the last World Cup final between England and New Zealand was, of course, affected by a red card quite early on. So I think fair to say that's a situation no one really wants to see happen again.
No, and it's still there for acts of serious foul play.
Yeah.
The full red card. So
Yeah.
I don't think anybody can complain about that anymore. So I think the answer is if you want to watch competitive rugby this weekend, I think it's probably the men's Rugby World Championship. Well, not World Championship, Rugby Southern Hemisphere Championship or whatever you call it, where the competition's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Like, don't not watch the women's. I think it's good. And it's been a hell of a successful tournament. It's broken every record. There might be some intrigue for a short time, but yeah, I fully expect those 4 teams to win by...
Country mile.
Like, really, all of them should win by 25 points or more, and some of them might be 50.
See, this is where it's difficult because I don't want to be seen to be like sort of putting down the women's tournament or anything. But I think you've got to be honest at this point. There's no point in hiding from it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't disagree.
And anyway, speaking from not hiding from things, obviously you had the Malcolm Gladwell.
Do we not?
Last
Sorry,
week.
just one last thought on the women's. You sent me a statistic which
Oh,
I knew was an issue, but like the actual stat is mind blowing.
yeah. I was listening to the post-match press conferences from both Wales and England. I noticed both of their coaches are obviously male. So I had a look and see how many male or female coaches there were in the World Cup, and only 3 teams have got a female head coach. So I asked you about that. I said, is it that seems very small representation? You said, oh, I wonder what it's like in women's Premiership rugby in England. And as it turns out, of the 9 teams, not one has got a female head coach. And I said, well, it seems a little bit odd to me that women's game is being promoted like this, apart from one of the key, it's not a key position. Well, it is a key position in the organization. Obviously, you've got female players, you have to have female players, but one of the key positions is being mainly taken up by men. And I understand why they do it because the men have probably got more experience. But it seems to be missing a trick to me as far as the women's game goes.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, what is that? Makes it 3 out of 25. And I know it's come up sometimes. I sit in these meetings with the women's high performance committees and welfare groups, and there's always discussion around how to get more women involved in the game. Obviously players, but also medical staff and of course coaches. It's a difficult one though, because no country is going to try and solve it at the national level. You know, they're going to try and say who's the best person for this particular job. So the development of coaches through a World Cup is probably asking a lot. What it therefore requires is that every country needs to try and develop it at the domestic level. But the women's domestic game is in such early stages of its own professional development. I was thinking about what it would take before this really became a systemic problem as opposed to just a maturation issue, if that distinction makes sense. And if you look at the men's game, I can't think of many national teams who are not coached by a former player who's now in their 40s, 50s, sometimes even older than that. And so there's clearly a pathway for coach development, which we can talk about as a separate subject altogether, I think. But women haven't had anything like the time for that pathway to have matured, and I think that's part of the reason for it. So anything you do to try and accelerate the growth is going to almost be bypassing and creating a new pathway in parallel to the sort of classically accepted, you play, you do your time, you learn, in the game, then you do your coaching qualifications, if at all, and then you become a coach when you are 40-something years old in your professional structure, coaching Cardiff or Leinster Stormers, and then you graduate in the national setup to the World Cup.
Okay, that makes sense. So my criticism is probably a little bit early. If we're still looking at this in 20 years' time and it's still all men's head coaches and players have had the chance to go through the pathway, then yeah.
Yeah. But the thing about it is, like, you can't be passive, right? Because if you don't try and accelerate it, then you'll just get the same thing happening over and over, because there will always be a 25-year head start on the men's side.
Indeed.
So they've got to do something. And World Rugby's got, I was looking it up, there are academies where they run these courses to try and uplift and improve the standard of coaches. But, if you can put 20 people a year through that, over 10 years, you might have had 200. I would be surprised if 10% of them, 20, become coaches. But hey, that's still 20 new coaches. So you have to do it, but it's going to take, I think, like 3 generations before you start seeing them filter through naturally as part of the system, but with a boost. It's the dilemma. South African sport knows this dilemma all too well because of apartheid and how it's taken us many generations to finally filter through, creating equal opportunities. And some would argue we still haven't done that.
Because you can't just shoehorn people in. And
Exactly.
It's interesting you mentioned the South African team. Because do you remember in the men's team, didn't it? You had to have a quota of black players.
Yeah, and
that's gone now, yeah.
As an official thing, it's gone. But I guarantee you, if we send a team out 2-3 weeks in a row, maybe even once, depending on the circumstances, with only 2 or 3 players who are not white, then there would be some people asking very serious questions. And it's there. It caused controversies in cricket at a World Cup once, where a selection was changed as a consequence of not meeting that quota. So it's a challenge. I don't think quotas necessarily work, especially at the top. But you have to try. Like I always say, if I owned 10 hectares of farmland and I only used 3, I'd be a fool. Why let 7 hectares lie fallow? That's kind of the model here. If you have all this potential, you have to farm it.
Okie dokie. Well, I did a perfect segue earlier on, and then forgot that we were going to talk about female coaches in rugby. So we'll head back to Gladwell without the perfect segue, because obviously you recorded that podcast with Malcolm, which turned out to be quite controversial because one of the early things he said was on the trans issue. And as I said to you afterwards, I didn't even bat an eyelid at that part of the podcast when I'd listened to it a few times, because it just didn't seem the most interesting topic to me. But we have got some other interesting topics that came up during it, and Discourse, as you mentioned earlier on, they latched straight onto those topics, didn't they, rather than the trans issue.
Yeah.
So I picked a couple of them out just to get your thoughts on them.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the first things he said was about the trans issue. One of the last things he mentioned was his suspicions of Keely Hodgkinson and her performances. And that was one of the first things that really raised eyebrows on Discourse, because a few people, I think David and Steve, they said there's a suggestion that Keely Haty's return from injury recently wasn't entirely natural. And I don't think it was just a suggestion. I think Malcolm pretty much put it out there straight out. And Steve actually said also, always interesting to hear other people's doubts on certain runners compared to others. You said you were sort of surprised by his candidness in saying this, right?
Yeah, I'm not surprised about suspicions about performances of any athlete. Doesn't matter who they are, because if that athlete's merely a data point, and all I'm looking at is a bunch of times and performances with dates, and I see someone who's now getting down to the 153 level, and the last time we saw that was in the 1980s, the back end of the 70s, 80s. You're saying, hang on a moment, this performance is an outlier, and any outlier is suspicious. I was a little bit surprised that he said it as directly as he did. But I'll say this, is you look at that list of the top 30 performances in history in the 800. At the very top is Jarmila Kratochvilova. It's now the oldest track record in the sport. I think from 1983, if memory serves me. And if you ever give a explanation of doping and where it's come from, Kratochvilova is in the Hall of Fame. Like, people use Kratochvilova pictures. There's 3 of them. There's Marita Koch in the 400, Kratochvilova, and then a shot put athlete called Heidi Kriegler, who ended up becoming Andreas Kriegler because of all the steroid hormones that they were provided with. And so, and then go down that list, and you will see name after name, and they all date from the 1970s and the 1980s. And the only exceptions to that, until Hodgkinson and Athing Mo came along, were male. Because you'd had Semenya, there were other athletes on that list. So I won't go through the names and so forth now. And so anytime, the point I'm trying to make is that if you put yourself in that company, of course people are going to say what's happening there. It's obvious.
But as a top athlete, you're going to put yourself in that company if you can.
Yeah, exactly.
Try and do it legally. And we've talked so many times about all the advantages you get these days. It's just, it always surprises me that people, sometimes they're very quick to jump to defense of their favorite athletes, I think. And I'm not saying that people have done that. But it does make me laugh when you think some of these athletes are clearly cleaner than clean. And anybody could be doping. We know that.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and we're not going to cover this in any detail, right? I woke up this morning, Raven Saunders, the US shot put athlete, got a 30-month ban overnight for a whereabouts failure. Second whereabouts failure ban in 4 years, right? Okay, so had, I think just before Tokyo, came back from a whereabouts ban. So that means missed 3 tests leading up to the Tokyo Olympics. Has now missed 3 tests post the Paris Olympics and is getting a ban. You sent me an article, Kenyan athlete who won the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc.
Not you. It was the OCC version, the shorter version.
The OCC
this
version.
Was, Joyline Chepangeno from Kenya. So.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to insert, those are 2 big doping news stories that will no doubt be discussed over on Discourse. And the point is, anyone could be doping. I just don't understand how anyone can say, she's clean, he's clean. There's always skepticism. It's not conviction.
But a lot of it depends. It's like Jonathan Edwards. It depends where you come from.
Yes, exactly.
I think.
Yeah.
If you've got the fans. Anyway, we'll move on because the next topic I was going to bring up, there was a lovely, and I'm not sure if you even used it in the podcast. I'd have to go back and check. Compression of adolescence. It's a lovely phrase that he used in a conversation with you, I think, beforehand as well.
And in the part he says compression of childhood. I did pick that up, yeah.
I like compression of adolescence because it rolls off the tongue a little bit better. But Gianluca made the point on Discourse. He said, Malcolm's comment on the protection of childhood, adolescence, and the paradox that exists therein. How we acknowledge that childhood is a period separate from adulthood, yet in domains that we've deemed necessary, we push children to grow up sooner. Super interesting insight. Unfortunately, in a world where keep up or get left behind is the mantra, I don't see a gross uptake in slowing down youth development. And I think that's a good point, that we are sort of, and Gladwell used the Victorian sort of example, didn't he? That we gave children all these rights, and now we're sort of removing them almost instantly. What were your thoughts on this phrase, compression of adolescence?
I loved that part, and when he spoke about how in the Victorian times we'd given children childhood back. I thought that was really great. I clipped part of that, and it was going to be one of the clips I was going to use to promote the podcast before it went in a different direction. I thought it was really good. I think it's a pretty profound insight. But one of the problems is, and he spoke about how in his children now, he's seeing it, and why must my daughter learn her ABCs? She's only 4. She'll get there eventually. The problem is, like, parents are so competitive. Like I mentioned a couple times, I've got friends now with kids who are moving through the early phases of school, and they are absolutely terrified that the child is falling behind, because the system doesn't allow people to fall behind, And that's the problem with early selection in sports, is if you don't get seen when you're 12 or 13, then the opportunity's gone. So that's directly causing that race to the bottom phenomenon. And I've always felt like the biggest problem is you can't fix it on an individual level, because you'd be asking someone to give up the only way in to the system. So everyone has to change it all at once, or no one can fix it. It's one of those classic standoff situations.
It's never really going to be fixed in that case, because it's just simply not. And it's not just sport, is it? We see this in all walks of life. We always say that kids are growing up faster than they ever did before, and we've got the internet there in front of tablets, screens all the time. I think it's one of those, when I was listening to the podcast, it's this and other topics, I think Malcolm, he likes to throw out ideas almost just to be controversial, and to see, it's like throwing out a net and seeing what the reaction is. And that sort of shapes the way he then thinks about the topic, perhaps.
Yeah, he even acknowledged it when we asked him about doping, and his position on that had changed. He says he was now sanguine. He used to be sanguinized, authoritarian. And we asked what changed, and I think he slipped in a line there. I was just being contrarian at the time. But I think one of the devices that people, and he's not the only one, but I think he does it maybe most effectively, is you put something quite extreme out there, and then people can work backwards from it. But because your position was so extreme, it really makes them think hard, because they see the worst case potential outcome. And one example of that was in the context of this compression of adolescence and the pressure that gets put on kids. He said, ban the parents. No,
Yeah.
everyone knows that can't happen. To his credit, he said at the outset, this is whimsical. Mike said it's not going to happen. And he and I both concluded, this is an unrealistic thing. But you put it on the table because parents, you hope, the reasonable ones, will go, am I that bad that I need to be banned? And you say, well, they're not going to ban me, but maybe just the possibility of that means I've got to change my behavior. I think that's a device that he uses on purpose.
Yeah, it's quite clever in a way. I think it's a good way of stirring debate, and obviously he's probably made a lot of money out of doing this. On that sort of topic, the relative age distribution got a lot of feedback, and some of that was from Joanne Ernst, because she wrote about Gladwell's iron law of the relative age effect. It is a very good post she wrote. It turns out the original research paper written by the Canadian who discovered this iron law, the relative age effect, I think it was in ice hockey. It focused on a relative age distribution in one season for 3 separate major hockey leagues. And the researchers' findings showed the distribution was like, I think, 40, 30, 20, and 10% of relative age distribution in roster share for this one season. And the NHL didn't find this. They were, I think, 32, 30, 22, and 16. So it's not an even distribution, to be sure, but not consistent with this iron law. But even so, from this analysis, Gladwell took it, and so his iron law, as they keep calling it, of relative age distribution was born. And Joanne's husband actually was part of the research who looked at this Canadian data and at these, and it turned out that these outliers weren't actually really outliers in the end. In fact, it was almost opposite. And as Gladwell, he says, acknowledged, many of his readers take his ideas out of context and apply them in unhelpful ways. And there are things perhaps Gladwell could do as a writer to minimize that possibility, but then his writing and findings wouldn't be as entertaining or provocative. In the case of the relative age effect, it seems likely the public's embrace of the idea fed into the zeitgeist that society and systems are more important determinants of our outcomes and successes than our own efforts are. It was a good post by Joanne to point out that sometimes Gladwell takes data, he takes scientific, and sort of almost twists it to his own narrative, right?
Yeah, so first of all, it was a superb post. Joanne always posts good stuff. If you join Discourse for no other reason to read posts like that, then you should. Secondly, the relative age effect, just because not everyone may have listened to that, is basically the phenomenon where when you're 10 or 11 years old and you're being selected into sports teams or even given attention by your teacher in academic subjects, a 10-year-old who is in a class with their peers could be up to 11 months, 12 months older than some of their friends or peers in the class. And a coach picking a soccer football team is going to pick based on their incentives, which is who's the best player. And the player with an 11-month head start at the age of 10 is considerably further ahead of their peers in terms of opportunities, maturation, age, and is therefore more likely to be picked. And so when you look at the proportion of junior teams that are born in the first quarter of that selection window, it tends to be way higher than those born in the fourth quarter, the younger kids. And I remember, so that was one of the most interesting things about the book. And I remember talking with David Epstein, because he was busy with Sports Gene, and he was coming at it from the opposite perspective about how biological genetic factors determine our success in life, not exposure to training, which is the model from Outliers. And he said to me, do you know that it's gone in the elite level in adults? If you look at NHL, football, and so I said, well, let's look at this in South African rugby, and sure enough, it doesn't exist. I think it's like more or less 30 to 35% across the year. So that's really interesting, and I've often wondered, and I should have asked Malcolm this when we spoke to him, is did he know that it was gone in adult level, but choose not to tell that? Or did he just not go beyond the junior where that phenomenon has been described because it served the purpose he was arguing for in that instance? Because I think that would determine the conclusion one makes. Because if he knew it was there but decided not to tell it, then he's chosen to simplify. Because he's right and you were right and Joanne's right, is if he wrote the whole story First of all, it would be nuanced and complex, and like it would be like our Zone 2 podcast, where the conclusion at the end of the book is it depends. That's not a bestseller. If I wrote a book, we called it Depends, and no one would buy it. And also, it would be 3 times longer. It would be like a doorstop thickness book. Hard read.
That's interesting, because it's sort of like the difference between science and journalism is what he does, I suppose, publishing, writing books. Is it in science, if you chose to omit something that you knew, then that would be downright wrong. It would be duplicitous. But he can actually do that as a journalist. He can choose to ignore parts of the narrative. And I think that's what Joanne's saying, other people have said. And I think that's a criticism, I think, of Gladwell, that he does pick and choose for his own means. But he isn't afraid then to come back, because he mentioned the 10,000 hours and how that was sort of twisted out of what he actually meant it to be. But as we said earlier on, he's not afraid to change his mind on subjects, that's for sure.
No, and we said strong opinions loosely held, and I think he really enjoys the challenge. I know when David then wrote the Sports Gene, and they had a few lively debates about some of the things he'd covered, including 10,000 hours and the relative age effect. I think he really enjoys that, so it's part of what he does. But I think, like the ban the parents and some of the other things, in the past he'd argued that doping should be allowed, and I think he puts these ideas on the table more to gauge the feedback of them. I'm not 100% sure, but Joanne made good points. So could he do a little bit more? I related in the interview how I'd gone to a talent symposium, and there were influential people in sport who were taking what he and others, Syed, Coyle at the time, were writing about 10,000 hours and talent and relative age, and developing high performance principles. And schools definitely would have implemented a lot of the ideas and so on in there. So yeah, I wonder how he would look back and say, I did a lousy job of it. Should I have done it differently? That's a different question, maybe.
Isn't there a danger of like the boy that cried wolf? That if you become known for this, then your word isn't taken as seriously anymore. If you were in the scientific circles and you did this, then nobody be listening to anything you said. But I mean, he's already made his money. He can say what he likes now. But there is a point where you think, well, he said this, but we know from history that he does tend to twist the truth, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that can possibly happen. But I think, again, the answer I enjoyed the most in the whole interview was when he tried to explain to Mike and I about his approach, and he spoke about how when you're talking to a group of experts who have a certain set of criteria that define them, they are highly motivated, they are very passionate, and their knowledge runs really deep. Whereas when you're talking to the public, they don't have any of those things, so you've got to try hook them in different ways. And then he used a word which I've told colleagues about a lot, which is, you've got to remember, most people are experience rich and theory poor. So that gets me thinking about everything we do. The instrumented mouth guards, the transgender debate is the one that came up again in the podcast interview. But pretty much everything about this podcast is talking to people who have lots of experience. They train, they exercise, they compete, they watch sport, they read the sports pages before they start on the front pages. And what we're trying to do is give theory to their experiences. So we're doing exactly what he's doing, but with a scientific standard applied to it as well. And it's that how you titrate or calibrate where you pitch it is, I think, the most difficult thing. I don't think he has any major regrets about where he's done it, because I think he sees himself as informing and entertaining in order to inform.
Yeah, it's just you're coming at it from a different angle. You're both talking to the same audience, but he's like talking up to them, and you're talking down sounds wrong.
Yeah,
you're trying to simplify.
Yeah, exactly. He's trying to spread wide, whereas we're trying to give depth, as it were, to people's experiences. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating insight into how he's thinking about those things. And I think it used to bother me a little bit more. I remember early on the relative age stuff, the 10,000 hours. We even wrote a paper, a geneticist and I, critiquing 10,000 hours and cited Gladwell in it as we built our rebuttal. It wasn't only him, obviously. The 10,000 hour was a guy called Anders Ericsson, who was the first guy who did that music study in Berlin that described how the best violinists had done 10,000 hours by the time they were graded as the best experts. But yeah, Gladwell became the sort of emblem of that that argument, and we got pretty riled up about it. I don't get as concerned about it anymore because I sort of understand it. But it's where it's tricky is if you're writing that and you know it's going to 100 people and you're trying to hook 80 of them, easily more than half of those 80 don't have the time, inclination, or ability potentially to discern which part you've left out, which part you haven't told them. Some would say that doesn't matter, but sometimes it sometimes it does.
But here's something. Substitute 10,000 hours for Zone 2 training. And you see the sort of same thing, that people want things extremely simple, and once an idea takes root and it takes hold and it changes, it morphs, and it's the same thing.
It's true. And that's why that podcast got us more negative blowback than anyone we've ever done. It's because we try to flip it, and then of course the title was Why Everything You Know Might Be Wrong, and I was like, oh, that's a Gladwell approach to the title of the podcast, and we were I was going to say, like, let's be happy in the grey areas around Zone 2 training, but again, it just doesn't make the impact.
That's interesting because it's the eternal sort of tension between science and journalism.
Yeah,
it's between you and Mike, between the journalist and the scientist.
And it happens all the time when we discuss who to interview, what approach to take, how to describe it afterwards. I think it's a positive and good sort of creative tension, but it's definitely there. We certainly don't always agree on how to pitch some of these things, So.
The last one I was going to touch on was as the role of entertainers, and our role of entertainers perhaps as podcasters, but the athletes as entertainers, because Malcolm brought that up as well, and it brought up a lot of comment on Discourse about whether athletes have they got the responsibility to be entertainers. I think it was Ravi who wrote a great post, Professional Athletes to Entertain or Not Entertain, because Malcolm had some ideas about providing data, sharing Strava and things like that. Ravi said, personally, I don't believe that athletes have a responsibility to entertain the crowd or viewership. I rarely think black and white about such topics. For this one, I feel that professional athletes are essentially out there doing their job, which is a very unique job, he says, but still a job, ultimately performing to make money and win for themselves or their team. And I understand that point of view, but I think the way that, and I think others have also has said that athletes, they do have a responsibility, because money doesn't come from nowhere in the field, especially like athletics or smaller sports. And this is the point I made, that smaller sports, you do need to promote yourself if you want to stay in that job. So what do you think of Malcolm's ideas about that?
Yeah,
I think Sean touched on it as well, didn't he?
Yeah, and actually, after we'd interviewed Sean, but before that pod went out, he wrote a piece for The Guardian, and I'm going to put that link to that in the show notes. He some of it you'd have heard him say, but now you can see what he's written also. I thought it was a really good post, that from Ravi, and then subsequent discussion quite interesting. I meant to go back and listen again to exactly how Gladwell said it, because I don't remember him saying they've got a responsibility to entertain, or if he said it in quite a strong language as that. But if I was an athlete and I was trying to maximize my earning potential for the 10 years of my career and beyond, I would make my entertainment value to the spectators one of the top priorities, right? Because it doesn't mean you have to, you don't have a responsibility to, but there's definitely a competitive advantage if you go about doing it. Now, the question is, what does it mean? Noah Lyles, you can see, has made a conscious decision to entertain, and I think that rubs a lot of people up the wrong way, but he's well known, so he'll say it's successful. If you watch the tennis final on the weekend, right, I'd say arguably most people, if surveyed, would say Alcaraz is the entertainer and Sinner is not, right? And that's personality, that's style, that's appearance, it's lots of different things, so it's difficult to quantify. But if I'm Sinner, I'm not saying, I'm not entertaining, I'm still playing as well as I can, make myself available, play in exhibition events, promote myself, in other words, and there's different ways to do that. So I think sometimes people think of entertain as a blunt concept when it needn't be.
Yeah, you don't need to be a clown.
Yeah, exactly. And whose career would you rather have, Kyrgios's or Sinner's?
Yeah, exactly. And plus your responsibility is to yourself as an athlete. You haven't got the responsibility to promote your sport as such, although it's going to benefit you in the long run. But it does, actually, flicking through it on Discourse, it does seem to be a split between those who want to be entertained. I think it's the way to grow sports, and those who prefer tradition. And in fact, we've seen both sides in the last few podcasts, because you had Gladwell advocating entertainment, Strava, and the same on the preview with Sean talking about the influencer, etc. And then you had Drew Gin on the rowing podcast, but he makes a good point about the future of rowing. He said rowing's advantage is history and legacy in a sport that's damn hard. Creating a circus of events confuses the audience. By diffusing the sport and picking up all these things that are seen as more entertaining or interesting for a short period of time, I think eventually the sport isn't going to die a death or not be existent, but you're handing over to control to entertainment rather than purity around performance. I think that's interesting. And I think because people appreciate sport because it is damn hard, as he says. And I think that the actual essence and the grit of sport is really important, and it shouldn't be lost in just making things entertaining for the sake of it.
Yeah, like and if you make it entertaining to the detriment of the core values, so what are those? Maybe the sport sometimes lose sight of that. I certainly feel that way sometimes listening to rugby decision makers talking about how they want to change the sport, and you say actually you're just evolving the sport away from what actually makes it valuable and special. So again, entertainment at the cost or to the detriment of the performance is pointless. You need performance, but then. And I think the key here is like, what do people want to be entertained by? And if you go to a basketball match, maybe half the show is the halftime act and not actually what happens on the court. That's not what I'm after.
Yeah, but do you really, are those the viewers that you're looking for? Because I was thinking about this. The way to make people fans, long-term life fans, is actually do the sport themselves as a kid. So if you bring a kid up through athletics or whatever sport, rugby, then they're a fan for life. They always will be if they actually do the sport. So it's investing in the grassroots and getting people involved early is more important, I think, than trying to catch eyeballs later on in life just through gimmicks.
Yeah, maybe like if Malcolm said in that podcast, if you swap entertain for engage, then the whole conversation is maybe different. No one would disagree that athletes need to engage their fan base, and that means different things.
Right or wrong?
Yeah.
In this one. So anyway, I thought the podcast was excellent. I've got to admit, it's one of those ones that I did enjoy re-listening to.
Yeah, I've listened to it a couple times now. Obviously, first pass and re-listened, and I thought it was great value. So many people have said they could listen to him speak all day. There's a certain, I'm not sure what he does, but there's a certain narration skill that I wish I had.
It's charisma. There's something charismatic about him, clearly.
Yeah.
But it's a shame it was drowned out a little, some of the other messages, because I thought they were far more entertaining.
Not on Discourse, and that's if there's one plug for Discourse, it's the one place you'll go, and people will find the 5 most interesting things, not the. Well, look again, it's not an uninteresting topic, and it's a very meaningful topic for a lot of people, but it did somewhat swamp some of the other really cool things, I think you said.
Yeah. And tomorrow we've got the 2 first events of the championships, the mixed 4x400 relay and the women's 10,000 metres. So we'll start off with the mixed 4x4, and I know you love your relays.
Yeah, this is especially a good one. I love the dynamic of the men-women. I still think to make this really entertaining, they should randomise the order and not let teams make their own selections. Because then some teams will go woman, woman, men, men, and other teams will do the opposite, men, men, woman, woman. And by the time you've had 800 meters of men against women, the lead will be 12 seconds, potentially. And then, obviously, now it flips. And can you catch up 12 seconds? Or can you hold on to that 12-second lead? So I think it would create so much intrigue. But what happens is they all go men, woman, woman, men. Because they want the longest first leg to be run by man. And then they want other athletes. Well, there's debate about whether it is in fact the longest. It's in theory not, but you can play with the length of those things because of the bend. But I think it's a great event. And remember, it gave us in Budapest in 2023 was the race where Femke Bol was leading it and then overreached in the last 10 meters and fell right at the end to lose to the United States. And then in Paris, they got revenge, as it were, by beating the US in that final. So it's produced, I think, some of the best racing in the championship, and it's a little bit of a shame that they stick it up front.
I was surprised it was at the front. Are you sure that they can choose their order of? I thought it was stipulated that they had to go man, woman, man, woman.
Now you've made me doubt myself. There used to be variation, because I've often used at the 2019 World Champs, I think, Poland finished with a woman, and obviously now by that stage their 2 men had gone. Everyone else saved their men to the very end. And so the Polish woman had a 50, 60 meter lead going into the final leg. And I've used that in presentations to show the difference that 10% makes between male and female. This is what it looks like in practice. So it has been like that in the past. I haven't seen anyone break from that in the recent past, which is either a consequence of a policy change or just everyone's figured out how to run it optimally.
Mm. I think the only intrigue in this one is between, like you say, it's between the USA and the Netherlands, is whether they get Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone or Femke Bol in.
Yeah, and I mean the US is also, they could put their top guys, Ja'Cory Patterson, Rai Benjamin, and if they do that and they've got McLaughlin-Levrone, Rai Benjamin, and Patterson, who's winning?
It's going to be the US.
Exactly. Even if Bol races, because they got Bol and Klaver, so their women are really strong, but their men are giving up 1 second per 400, and that's too much. In fact, probably more like 1.5. So much about this depends on who makes the selections and who wants to run them. And the problem is, no matter where you put it in the program, like Bol and McLaughlin-Levrone probably don't do it, but I think they'd be more likely to do it at the end. No? Because they're not risking anything anymore.
Indeed. That's why I was surprised to see it up front. Well, the other event final on Saturday is the women's 10,000 meters.
Yep, and I think this is going to be a good one. And these are really hard to call, actually. Maybe not the women's, because you never see it. There's literally one of these a year, basically, at a global one. Obviously, there's a qualifier at SA Champs or Kenyan Champs, US Champs, etc. But we get one shot at seeing them all race each other, and it's at the Worlds.
Well, you've already said, I think earlier in one of our spotlights, you said you think Chebet is clearly the favourite for this one. And I was obviously completely confused because I thought Sergei was running the 1500. So nobody's going to take my advice on this one. Can you see anybody beating Chebet in it?
There's always a chance of that. It's not like the quarterfinals in the rugby. I wouldn't make the second favourite here a 50-1 or 100-1. But it's hard to see how, because Chebet is the only woman ever to go under 29, right? Mm-hmm. She's the world record holder. We've seen in Paris last year, she's got a final 200, and all this year, a final 200 that no one's even close to matching. She's got a 5,000 that's under 14, world record there. Her 3,000 is unbelievably good. Her 1,500 maybe not as much. So how do you beat that? Like, what's your approach if you're anyone else? I think there's one possibility here, and it came up in the discussion with Sean, is that Tsegay will say, I'm the better 1,500 meter athlete. Tsegay can run a 3:51 1,500. Chebet's a 3:54 earlier this year. So does Tsegay have it in to go with 1 mile to go, 4 laps to go, and just say, I'm turning this into that race now? And if you are capable of doing it off the back of 8,400, then good for you. That's the question.
But you've got to have the confidence to do that.
Yeah, and Tsegay's got that. So I will say, I fully expect her to try, because the one thing she's got is she's gutsy and brave. I really enjoy watching her run. She's not always smart, I don't think. But in this race, I think the smart thing to do is to go for it. The question is, she's the world champion from Budapest, so she's defending it. She didn't get a medal in Tokyo. She ran in both the 15 and the 5, I think, or maybe the 5:10, but she didn't pick up a medal. So she might be coming into this saying, you know what, silver's actually not bad. So am I willing to potentially risk 4th or 5th place in exchange for gold, or would I rather race more conservatively and try and pick up a silver or a bronze? Because if they sit on Chebet for 9,500 meters, she's winning by 10 meters.
Yeah,
no problem.
And they've got to know this. I mean, we know it, so they've got to know it.
Yeah, I think so. Now, it's not just the two of them. Agnes and Getich was second in the Kenyan Championships, and the Kenyan champion is Chep-and Getich, Janeth Chep-and Getich. Mm-hmm. So, and they are good. I mean, they'll be close to 30 minutes if they have to be. Agnes and Getich has broken 30 in her life. She's the only woman ever to run under 30 minutes in a woman-only race. She ran 29:27 on the roads. And she also won the Grand Slam track distance races earlier this year, Johnson's races. So I think she'll be competitive. And then Cup.and is the current world leader. She's got a PB just outside 30, I think 30.05. But she's not run in the global championships. And then there's the Italian Battocletti, was the silver medalist in Paris. And so you wouldn't rule her out. She was only beaten by Chebet there. So there's a pretty strong field in this race. I think it'll be a really good start to the championships. But really interesting to see how everyone goes about dealing with Chebet's strengths. If I was Tega, as I say, I'd hope that it's really slow up to 6-7 Ks. And then with 4 laps to go, I'm trying to run I think Tega has to try and run a 3:58 for the last 1500. And maybe she can she can burn Chebet's kickoff.
You see, the one thing I think is that we are sometimes critical about athletes' decision-making and pacing. It was only when I listened to the Gladwell pod when he talked about the 800 meters that we forget that these athletes are actually right at the limits performance-wise, and decision-making is difficult at that point.
Yeah, exactly. That's why when you watch the Tour de France, and even now in the Vuelta, when they finish the stages, everyone says, oh, why doesn't Jonas attack? Well, Jonas is not attacking because he's bleeding from his eyes.
Yeah.
Like he's a 10 out of 10, and he's been a 10 out of 10 for the last 4 kilometers, and if he stands up out of he's going to blow.
Yeah, but it's not just physically, it's mentally.
It's
just concentrating so hard on not like blowing up, as you say, mentally. You don't have that. You just think, I'm not going to make these decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, and coming back to Tsega, in her 1500 races, she's, and I mean, maybe imagine there's some master plan here, and she's doing this on purpose. She's hitting the first 2 laps of a 1500 in 60 seconds, 2 minutes through 800. It's suicidal. And she's paying for it at the end. But maybe she's learning how to do that, and she's wanting to challenge herself because that's what she's going to take into Tokyo. So I think there's a lot of intrigue in this race, actually, because of how she goes about dealing with the Chebet problem. Chebet, I think, for her part, wants this race to be as slow and as easy as possible so that she can win it with minimal energy expenditure. And of course, it's interesting. Like, what about Atleti? What does Ngetech do? How do they see it playing out? Do the Kenyans even try and run tactically? I doubt it, because they've got the best athlete, no matter how it's run. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty cool first individual gold medal on the track.
Yep. Well, we'll be back tomorrow to dissect it.
Yeah, the plan is, I've said before, we've got a few obligations and work things. The timing is not always easy, but where possible, we'll be on the night after, as it were, for the UK listeners, the night after, to try and explain how badly wrong we got our predictions and justify ourselves. Anything else?
No, I'm good for today.
Yeah, so am I. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. As I said up front, there's going to be... let's mention on Discourse, we've got very kindly, one of our Discourse members is running once again for us a prediction contest for Tokyo. Basically, all you have to do is pick the winners. That's all. Use the ranking lists if you're stuck. And yeah, that's being tracked and monitored like it was for Paris. It was good fun. So if you're a Discourse member, please sign up and play the game.
Yes, Mike and Madison.
Yeah, Mike and Madison's running it for us. Thank you. So get onto that. Links in the show notes to become a Discourse member, along with a couple of the other articles related to what we've discussed on the show. We will not see you on Spotlight for a little while, but we will see you on our Tokyo 2025 show. So until then, for now, from both Gareth and myself, goodbye.